Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
Welcome back to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. Our guests today are Dave Goetz and Melissa Parks, co-founders of Journey 66. Dave and Melissa, thank you so much for joining us. We are really excited to have you on the show today.
We're delighted to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So before Stan and I dive in, and as you know, we already have a lot of questions, but before we dive in, I was hoping each of you could take just a couple of minutes apiece and tell our listeners a little bit about kind of your personal background and then what inspired you to get together to found Journey 66.
Sure. So I'll start out just personally who I am. Aside from being a leader here at Journey 66, I am an antiques lover and recently went on a trip to Italy as a speaker, and it was an antiquing trip. And so I love the stories that go along with treasured items. So I think I'm naturally drawn to history and the stories that items tell. And I love Italy. I can't wait to go back. But aside from that, I do have a background in editorial. Dave and I met at a publishing company. Gosh, I don't even know how many years ago, almost 30 years ago, and have been working together in publishing, writing, producing ever since then. And how did we get in this space? We've always had a unique relationship with advisors in the family business space, and really were then referred to families who wanted to tell their family business stories. And we've been working with families now for, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. How many years?
Well, 15 years ago since we started with the legacy conversation.
Right. So I'll bump it to you, Dave.
Well, I, like Melissa, in terms of personally, Stan and I were talking earlier about just loving fly fishing. I have a podcast, Two Guys in a River. I've done a book, and I'm not very good at fly fishing. And so the whole point of the podcast is two guys talking about fly fishing who talk about life and also talk about fly fishing a little bit. So I've spent a lot of time in the West fly fishing, but also here in the Midwest, there's a lot of great streams in the Driftless. But Melissa and I have worked together. We started, again, at a publishing company, and then I started a marketing firm, strategic marketing firm in 2000. And then she came to work with me there. And that's when we began starting working with families. We joined a family business association in the early 2000s, maybe it was 2004, 2005. And then we just started working with them on different book projects. And then over time, we said, why don't we just formalize this? And then Melissa and I became partners in the business, and then decided to do that full time. So we still have the marketing business, but Melissa and I are partners in Journey 66 and are full time in that. So we've been doing this a long time, and grateful for Melissa and grateful for the opportunity to serve families and their advisors.
Fantastic. So tell our listeners a little bit more about Journey 66 and exactly the types of projects you do and the types of services that you guys provide.
Do you want to start?
So we like to say we're a creative consulting firm and production firm for families and their advisors. So family businesses often and their advisors. And a good example, we're working with a family right now out of South Dakota that is one of the largest electrical construction businesses in North America, privately held business. And they're coming up on their 55th anniversary. And so the founder wanted to do a project that captured the history and story of the business as it was early on. He went to Vietnam, started the business. It's had phenomenal growth, but also where the business is going. So it's not just merely the history of the business, but where it's also headed. So that project is going to be a book project. But when we work with families, what we call the family legacy keepsake, it's all over the map. It can be a documentary, it can be a digital anthology, We've done projects where there have only been 50 copies made of the book. Sometimes it's distributed very narrowly just to family members. With this project in South Dakota, it will be delivered to all employees, stakeholders, their family advisory council. And so it's delivered more broadly. So every family is unique. Every family is different. And they have different vision for what they want to do. Generally, though, they're trying to capture a story. They all have these stories in their head, but they don't have a way to kind of capture the overarching narrative and to interpret that story in a way that makes sense to them. And so that's what we do at Journey 66.
That is really cool. And go ahead. No, please add to that, Melissa.
I would say often family members come to us because they're at a place in their lives where there's either a celebration, so it's a milestone, or they're facing their own mortality, and they're very concerned about capturing these values that are on plaques in their boardroom wall, but people, the next generation specifically, they may not exactly know how those ideals and those values were formed. And so they come with this urgency to pass on those values and the reason behind those values to the next generation. So that's often when people reach out to us, and our key role is really helping to interpret those stories and to draw out from them the meaning from those stories, and to then produce them or to write them in a way that really connects with the next generation or even stakeholders in some cases.
Very cool. Yeah, on your website, I love it. And for our listeners, we will be sure to include this in the bio so you guys can find it. It's journey66.com. But on the website, there are some really great examples of some of the types of work you've done. And I thought they were fascinating. Some that are really obviously more focused on the history of the family business, the history of the family, some kind of like a personal memoir, and then some that are really focused more on a leadership book, a book written for guidance by maybe the business founder or on a specific topic like succession planning. So it looks like the projects that you do are kind of all over the board. So if someone comes to you, or if our listeners are interested in starting a project like this, what does that process look like, figuring out what the project is going to be, and how do you do this over Zoom, and are there multiple people involved? Walk us through what this process really looks like.
You go first, Dave.
Often, in fact, rarely does someone come to us with something nailed down. And so it's always, we're thinking about doing this. We're not really sure what we want to do. So we have what we call the discovery phase that has a period to the end of it, so that there's not this huge commitment without knowing what you're doing. And so we also do it on the book side. If we're doing a book with advisors, we call it the jump start, but it's the exact same thing, but it's a discovery phase that identifies what it is that they want to actually do. And so we work with them. Usually sometimes it's 2 full days. Sometimes we'll do it in person. It depends on the family. Sometimes it's a combination of doing it in person and Zoom conversations. It really depends on the situation. The larger, more substantive projects that end up being up over a year, for example, I just mentioned this family in South Dakota. That's a substantive project that will take roughly about 10 months. And so we have been out to their place twice. They've shown us, they have a bunch of property out in the prairie that they've purchased. And so they've taken us on tours. They've taken us tours of their business. So that was important to be there in person to see that, because it was part of the work and researching it. But every family is different. Sometimes they are done only over Zoom. So we have this discovery process that makes it easy for the family to identify what it is they really want, to put together a plan for that and the expense for that as well. So it's very clear to them what that next phase is, which is the creating of that actual process and what that keepsake is going to be.
And I could
That's great.
to the creative. Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
go ahead, Melissa.
So in that next phase, the creative phase, that's the meaty part of the engagement, because that's when we continue to do research. We look at archive materials, we look at pictures. And then we continue to do very specific interviews with different people who the family identifies and who we ask to interview. And of course, it's approved by the families. And in that initial phase, we have like a blueprint. So if it's a book, for instance, we kind of have this overall structure that we are going to try to follow. It evolves over time. And then we start just knocking out chapter by chapter. And it's a series of interviews with people. We write the draft, it goes back to them, they review it, they make their edits, and then we're on to the next chapter. So with a video, a documentary, it's a little bit different because that obviously is based on a script and a storyboard, but there's no less research that goes on. In fact, there might be even a little bit more because it's a visual medium, and so you need a lot of visual things to make that really shine. So you start these pre-interviews where you identify the narrative arc and you begin to put together the script, and then you go in and do an actual video shoot and ask very specific questions for the stories that you want the individuals to tell. So that's all part of this creative phase. With an anthology, it's a little bit different. That's you're doing the interviews and you're collecting them through video, and then you're beginning to segment them based on usually around themes or values. So it's a really easy way to index these stories.
And then the final phase is just the post-production, delivering, creating that. If it's a documentary, getting that all ready, getting those final files edited. If it's a book, it's publishing it a book. Again, those sound like really big projects. Some of them, they're very simple. Just recently, we gave a proposal to a family they just wanted a simple timeline for the business. The business was 60 years old. And so the deliverable was a video that was a timeline, the motion graphic type video. And then also the other part of the proposal was digitizing that for the web so that they could add some code and their developer could load that onto the website. So for their website visitors and their prospects could see that online. So it was a historical, in a sense, timeline of the development and growth of the business. So that was a much smaller type of a project. So every project is different.
Very unique. Stan, I've stolen all the good questions so far, and I know you have some. So I will be quiet and let you ask yours for a moment.
Yeah. So our clients at our firm and the clients our listeners have run the full gamut of economic success. Some are just all American average folks. Some are successful, wealthy business owners. In every place in between. Can you give us an idea of the kinds of things that you are able to offer that might be appropriate and available to people because when you talk about spending 10 months on a project and getting on planes and flying to go see people, all that sounds like, there's some investment involved in that, of course, but, I would be curious to get a sense about what kind of investments are required to do these things and what kinds of things you can do that would fit the different ranges of clientele.
Go ahead.
That's correct. So obviously a book project in which we're doing the research, working with the family to identify the stories, and it ends up being a 10-month project in which you're also publishing the book. That's a substantive project, and those end up anywhere from $80,000 to $100,000. So that's a meaty project. And unless there's a large event, a 100-year-old business or a 50-year-old business or usually most families, unless they're at some significant level, are able to do that. Or this is the same is true with a documentary, but there's smaller projects like the timeline project that I just mentioned was a quarter of that, right? So that was a smaller family business that wanted to do the timeline. And so it was a quarter of, it was maybe $20,000 to $25,000. So it's much different. So families, I think often we can also do what we call that discovery phase and help families set up them doing it themselves. So we can coach them on setting up and just help map that out for them. So often families just don't know where to start. Like, where do we go? What's the first steps? What do we need to research? They know they have a pile of photos. They know they have all these stories. They want to capture those stories, but the stories tend to be very abstract. And unless they have somebody interviewing them who's a bit objective and can really push them, because a lot of the stories that people have, the best stories are still inside their heads. And the way when we do our research, we do the research and then we don't do the interviews until after we've done the initial research, because we need to know what the stories are. And sometimes we'll do, for example, in this one documentary, we had brothers that hadn't spoken to each other for quite some time about a fire that happened in 1955 that they both remembered. And in that interview with the two of them, they realized that they both had memories that were different of the fire. And so sometimes when you start doing these interviews, you get some really wonderful, almost conflicting memories. But what you end up is this robust family story that you would have never had before, because if only one person is kind of having these reflections, you're getting a very one-dimensional view of that story. So the point is that in that discovery phase, and those discovery phases range anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000. That will help people actually set themselves up to actually do it themselves.
Every year that goes by, I think I appreciate even more the power, the impact that stories have on people, on families. And so let me ask, you guys have done this for a while now, and without revealing any names, I'm just curious if you could offer some observations on example or two of the kind of impact that this work has had on the families that you've served.
I can tell a story of a gentleman we worked with. This was probably about 10 years ago, and he was an Orthodox Jew. He grew up in South Africa, and he started an oil business as a young man. And he ended up selling that business and moving to the United States. He sold it to a German conglomerate, ironically, but he was asked to come lead the American division here in America. So he moved, but his sons stayed behind with their mother. And so he was separated from his two sons for a long period of time. And part of the messiness of that is that he had an affair with his wife's first cousin. And so there was a lot of family conflict. And so part of his reasoning for writing this book was to talk about how his Orthodox Judaism has informed every part of his life. And so right in the middle of this book is chapter 5, is when he says, I've made so many mistakes in my life. And one of them being the affair, but there were 3 or 4 other ones that he admitted to. And one of them was not being a great dad, not being a great father, and how this book was meant to make things right. And it was because of his Judaism that it's not necessarily the mistakes that you make, but how do you make things right? And so this was a very limited copy. They had limited copies published of this book, and he gave it to his family, and he wanted his grandchildren eventually to read it, and they were very young toddlers at the time. And that was really powerful because he was giving these versions of the chapters. He was giving these versions of the chapters to his sons as they were being written, and it opened up all these wonderful conversations and some real healing. And that was a really wonderful thing to be part of. It wasn't just a book, but it was part of healing the family.
So that causes me to ask, it would seem a really courageous act for a guy to put all of the dirty laundry out there in print. I'm wondering, do you often run into families that want to airbrush it? Is that a common thing?
In one of our recent engagements, we did have a family where there were some skeletons in the closet, and one of the family members was really resistant to the project being done because of those skeletons and not wanting them to be made public. So yeah, there is some real fear about bringing some things to light. And because this project was not solely a personal story, but a family business story, and the purpose was about the business, those stories didn't actually come into play. But there was a lot of assurance that we had to do on our part to say, these things are not going to be in the book because they're not part of the narrative arc of the business. And that's really what this book was meant to be. Do you want to add to that?
It's a really good question. Ultimately, the family makes those decisions about what goes in and what doesn't go in. And when you think about we talk about the narrative arc. Every family has multiple stories that could be told, multiple narratives. Because like you and I could write 3 or 4 or 5 memoirs. Because a memoir isn't an autobiography. It's not about the whole thing. You're taking a slice of your life and you're writing about it. And it's similar to that when a family decides to write a family business story or even decides to talk about their family legacy. And so you're making choices about what goes in and what doesn't go in. And that's perfectly legit. It's not like you're hiding things, or it's the decisions that you make. And in his case, this Orthodox Jew, in fact, I remember the process when we started working on chapter 5, and Melissa and I were looking at each other like, really? You're going to put that in chapter 5? But he was but that was part of what he wanted to do. There was no other pressure, so it really depends on the family and their decision. So I don't want families to think that's the purpose of this, is somehow to, roll out skeletons or roll out things they don't want to say. That's not the purpose of a story. I do think that stories should be healing. And there's a way to write about things in a way that really does bring healing. Stories have that power to connect family members that have been disconnected. And so I think it's a really good question. Let me tell you one more story. We were working with the founder, and this was, 6, 7 years ago, and he had just had a chemo treatment and he had lung cancer. It was the second cancer that he had. And so Melissa and I were in Seal Beach, California, visiting him right before Christmas. And he said, listen, I'm going to have a chemo treatment the day you get here. And he wanted to write a book about generosity. The name of the book is called Releasing Generosity. And I know a lot of these stories are about books, but there's a lot of other ways to do things in terms of documentaries. There's just a lot of ways, but this was another book story. But so we get there about noon. Seal Beach, is this beautiful place on the coast of Southern California. And so we get to his small flat, beautiful, beautiful flat near the beach. You can see the ocean from his place. And he is moving slow. I mean, he is moving really slow. So we have about an hour and a half of interviewing him. We're interviewing him for a couple chapters. We get to about 3:00 and he goes, man, I got to take a nap. I'm just dying here. He said, listen, I'll take you down to the pier and then I got to come back and take a nap. But I want to do one more set of interviews tonight, and we'll do it over dinner at this seafood place. And he is crumping. I mean, this guy is like, I'm thinking, how is he going to do another set of interviews? So we said, so he takes us out to the beach. It was only about a half hour, which is, just walk out to the pier, come back. And I say, listen, Randy, we don't, you don't need to do this. No. I'll see you at 6:00 down at this. So Melissa and I take off. We spend, we do whatever, and we come back at 6:00. So here we are having dinner with him. And by this time, he was worse off. And he was so fiercely committed to this interview because he was so fiercely committed to his mission to talk about what was so important to him. There were points where you could hardly hear him talk. And we had the tape recorder, of course, going to capture it. It was one of the most, I would say, of everything we've done, and it's hard for me to talk about it. It was probably the most moving thing I've ever experienced of a family member who was so fiercely committed to talking about what they value. And it was a value that he had. And it just taught me about the importance of what we do and why these stories matter. And here he was, and he survived that round of chemo. And then 3 years later, he passed. But it was just a really powerful moment. I'll never forget it.
You ever had the opportunity to, to assess the impact of this kind of work on the younger generation family members? I can see from the perspective of the senior generation being able to really distill and bring clarity to your life experiences and articulate a message that really emerges out of that experience. I'm wondering if you've been able to see it from the other side of the table over time to get a sense about what the kids or the grandkids or maybe employees of a business, what's their response been to this kind of content?
Yeah, we often don't hear from from the people that we work with, years down the road. But I can tell you that the process itself has a huge impact on the next generation, because as we have these group interviews, for instance, with the founder, maybe another key leader in the business, and then the second generation leader, the founder is telling these stories as we're interviewing them and asking follow-up questions. And we had this just recently. The second generation is like, I never knew that's why we do things that way. It was an actual light bulb moment. And he's about ready to be, I think he became the CEO recently. And so suddenly this value that he knew about, and he knew the story vaguely, but not incomplete. And it really shaped him in this moment. You could tell that he was going to hang on to that as he took over leadership of the company. What would you add to that, Dave?
I think that's a great example. And I was thinking also, there's a family business we worked with that was 120 years old, and they are moving, they have an extended third generation. They're going to have 3 presidents from the third generation, but the fourth generation is right on the heels of the third generation. And that fourth generation, he'll be the next president within the next 5 years, he was in all the conversations and listening. I mean, the way he listened, the way he asked questions during our interviews, not of us, of course, but of his seniors, of the current president, it was really wonderful. And you got the sense that the same thing, he had never heard some of these conversations, or he'd not heard some of these stories before. And so
I would say also that they have heard the stories, and at the third, fourth generation, they're like, man, we've got to get dad or grandpa talking about this before they pass away or before their memory goes. And so, because they don't feel confident enough in their ability to retell the story because they didn't experience it. And so suddenly there is this urgency from the third and fourth generation, sometimes the second generation, like, we got to sit our father down or our grandfather down and get them to tell this in first person and let us get the details as much as possible, because at some point they were moved by the story, but they can't remember it well enough to tell to their children. So that's a way that it's really important for the next gen.
I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. I did some work on that and found that there's an equivalent phrase in 12 or 13 languages that that say that. Like, I think in Japanese, I can't do it in Japanese, but it's something like rice paddies to rice paddies in 3 generations. So, I'm wondering, I'm speculating with you, it seems to me that the work that you guys do may be the power tool that breaks that cycle and allows that business to survive beyond that third generation into multiple generations for years and generations beyond. And I think that that being able to share the story, the impact, the stories of struggle. One of the things I've found in my work is that my clients who created wealth in many cases did it by starting the business, on a shoestring. They missed meals. They didn't take vacations. They drove really old cars in order to launch the business. And so they worked nights and weekends. And so there was all this, the stories of work ethic and sacrifice. And my experience has been that the second generation can relate to that because typically they were around and old enough to kind of remember when mom and dad weren't wealthy. But that third generation and the fourth generation, they just emerge into the world. And from day one, they have financial security. They're wealthy. They're looked up to in the community because, they have status and money. And what I found is that first generation guy who still is very emotionally connected to the struggle that originated that business has a really challenging time connecting at any heart level with that third and fourth generation because their lives are so different because those generations never knew the struggle. And so it just seems to me that the work you guys do is really the power tool that can connect these generations who really are so incredibly different because of those different life experiences, even though they're all they all have the same biological connection. the stories of struggle or lack of struggle are just so different. And it's exciting. I think that what you guys do is really amazing work. And I'm hoping a lot of our listeners will take the opportunity to really connect with you guys and look at the different tools and strategies that you use to make these connections. I think that even in financial terms, like keeping the business viable for multiple generations, just in financial terms, has a lot of merit. But these stories are really the glue that go beyond just the financial statement.
Mhm.
One of the most moving stories was this client that we had that they had this fire in 1955. It was the one whose business was started in 1907 when the Cubs won the World Series for the first time. And we're in Chicago, so we would think about things like that. But they had this fire that took down everything. They were a retail operation. They had trucks that delivered fuel. And they were started in 1907, and they would deliver. They had mules that would deliver hay and coal up and down the west side of Chicago. 1955, of course, at that point they had trucks and they were delivering fuel to consumers. Today they're one of the leading master distributors in North America. So they changed from being business to consumer to business. But in 1955, they were primarily business to consumers. So they were delivering fuel to people's homes. So they had this huge fire that basically took out their entire fleet of trucks. So there were people that we interviewed, the two brothers, that still remember, the older brother still remember the smell. They remember the ball of flame. And so they wanted to capture that before they passed on, or else, lost their memory to Alzheimer's or something like that. But one of the things that came out, and it was so moving, and was that right after this, it would have destroyed the business, but they were part of an association called the Oil Man's Association. And two of their competitors that were part of that association came in and said, "Hey, it's hard for me to talk about this. It's so moving." Said, "We will serve all your customers until you get back on your feet." So they served their customers during the winter and allowed that business to get back on its feet. So when you look at that plaque on their boardroom wall and it talks about generosity, you think that is just a little plaque on the wall, a little simple value. No, that value was embedded from 1907 when that family during the Great Depression would allow customers not to pay their bill, even though they could, would carry customers who couldn't pay their coal bill. And then they were given that grace in 1955 on this fire. So this value is so deeply embedded in this family. And you can just feel it today. And when COVID came in 2000, they didn't let any employees go, even though a lot of other companies, at least in Chicago, were doing it. They said, "Hey, we have to put more money into the business. We're going to do it at our own expense, but we're not letting anybody go." And this was before they knew, this is way before we knew that it was, that they're going to be okay. So this family, it just, when you do these stories, you realize what makes America great are these family businesses and these deeply held values that come from these deeply embedded stories. That's where the values were created, were in these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. It always amazes me when I deal with clients that don't have a business or they're not very successful financially. The attitude they have about business owners who are successful is so different from the reality of those people that I know. It's just incredible. Well, you guys, this has been an exciting time. We could have this conversation for a long time, and I'm a little envious actually. You guys get to be inside the gathering and the framing of the message and collecting the data, putting it all together, and turning it into a, a product, a tool that has emotional, compelling power, and that's got to be a pretty cool way to make a living, I'd say.
It's a great way to
Yeah,
make a
it
living.
gives us great joy. I tell you, working with families is just the greatest joy, just the greatest joy.
That is incredible. Well, Dave and Melissa, thank you both so much for being on the show and taking your time to talk about this incredible mission that you guys do, this incredible service to all of these businesses and these consultants as well. And for our listeners, we want to thank you for joining us as well. This has been the Legacy Leader Podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. And to find out more about the work that Dave and Melissa do, you can visit journey66.com. We will link that for you in the show notes so it's easy to find. And once again, Dave and Melissa, thank you so much for taking your time to join us. This was really incredible.
Thank you so much for having us. It was incredible for us as well.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.
49 faces looked to him in triumph. Over the last 12 months, they had each taken turns and promoted his business for a week at a time, driving over $987,342 in revenue. What if you had a network of 50 centers of influence who promoted your business every week for a year? Grab your copy of the #1 Amazon best-selling book, The Ultimate Guide to Growing Your Business with a Podcast, at 33% off the Amazon price by going to ultimatepodcastbook.com. Again, that website for 33% off the Amazon price is ultimatepodcastbook.com.